How many here are either founders or employees at a startup company? And how many of you are in Poland? And are any of you considering moving to relocating, setting up an office in San Francisco or Silicon Valley or anywhere in the Bay Area? A few. Okay. So I hope some of this will be relevant for you. So I did the same thing a couple of years ago. So I just returned after a few years in San Francisco. So I'll try to share a little bit of experience. I'll talk both about pros and cons of setting up an office there, whether it's relocating your entire startup or setting up a subsidiary. So let's start with the pros. Primarily, the reason why people go there is for access. Access to various things, and it'll depend on your situation, what's most relevant to you. But one of the reasons why you see a lot of companies move there is access to investors, access to venture capital. So if we look at the amount of venture capital invested into a couple of different regions last year, here we have the San Francisco Bay Area, we have New York, we have the Pacific Northwest, which is primarily Seattle and Portland, and we have all of Europe. You can see that even though the Bay Area has less than 10 million people, about 2.5 times as much venture capital was invested into the Bay Area as all of Europe, which has 500 million people. So it's extremely skewed to that very small region. If you look at number of deals instead of amount invested, you see a similar picture. You can see that there's it's slightly more even comparing Europe and the Bay Area, which tells you that the ticket size tends to be significantly smaller here. So not only do you raise more money over there, you also raise bigger money in each round. Now, only because the VCs are there, does that necessarily mean that you have to go there as a European startup? I don't know who said this. I won't invest if I can't drive to the board meeting. I've been trying to find out who said the original quote. It might even be an urban legend, but nonetheless, it rings true for a lot of reasoning of not everyone by far, but a lot of investors out there. They do want you to be local. If they invest in you from outside of the Silicon Valley, they prefer if you have at least a plan to relocate there. It doesn't have to be that way. This, by the way, is about how far you can get from Sand Hill Road, which is the epicenter of the Silicon Valley venture capital industry, in an hour. If you've spent a lot of time there, you'll know that this is quite optimistic during rush hour, which has pretty much expanded to cover the whole day. You won't get anywhere near as far in an hour. So the area that they invest in is pretty small. It's just the Bay Area, but it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. At Wrapp that I mentioned, my previous company, we did raise our Series A partially from a Silicon Valley investor. We raised it from Atomica, which is based in London, and Greylock, which is based on Sand Hill Road. It's one of the primary Silicon Valley VCs. And we even got Reid Hoffman, who founded LinkedIn and is a partner at Greylock, to join our board. However, after that, pretty much every board meeting was held at the LinkedIn office in Mountain View. So they do want you to sort of at least start planning for how you can set up a presence over there to the large extent. There are exceptions, of course. If you're already enormously successful, then you can pick and choose and raise money from anyone. And then the reason for getting money from a Silicon Valley VC is probably because you want help to move over there. But it's a different story. If you're at early stage, you can't really pick and choose as much. So the other reason why a lot of startups go there is because they want access to partners and they want access to markets. So this is an example of a company started in Copenhagen, Denmark. It's called Opit. It's a company that I worked with a little bit. They're building a web operations software. It's a software as a service model. It's essentially a modern, better in my opinion, competitor to New Relic. And for them, they're in that group of companies that are essentially building the picks and shovels, the tools for the new Californian gold rush. And their market is over there. Their market is other developers, other startups, other tech companies. So for them, it pretty much makes sense to have, if not the entire company there, at least a presence there. And they are setting up an office there, even though they've managed so far to run it from Copenhagen with frequent trips over there to attend conferences and other events, host launch partners and whatnot. Because not only is the market over there, I mean the market is global, so it's not explicitly over there, but not only is the primary market over there, but that's also, more importantly, where trends in our industry tend to be shaped. So the tools that become popular with the Silicon Valley startups are the ones that get mentioned in the press. They're the ones that get the attention from the rest of the world. They're the ones that get the mind share. Another example is a Swedish company called Toka Boka. It was started in Stockholm, Sweden by two friends of mine. It's one of the most successful kids app studios. And they're still primarily based in Stockholm, but the CEO moved over to San Francisco a couple of years ago, and the reason for doing that is not because their market is there. Their market is truly global, and it's not specifically, they're selling to kids or kids' parents. It's not specifically, it doesn't have anything to do with tech startups per se. But the reason why they need to be there is because they need access to Google and Apple. They need to build relationships with the gatekeepers and the kingmakers of the app stores. And it's been a very important ingredient in their tremendous success that they have built up these very good relationships over years. So they're sure to be featured in a lot of markets, and all of that is run out of Cupertino and Mountain View. So I want to talk about one last benefit, and it's not the weather. California isn't as sunny as you would think it is if you're in San Francisco. It's mostly foggy. And that's access to talent. And that can mean that can mean different things for different companies. So if you look at American companies that set up an office in Silicon Valley, it's mostly to tap engineering talent. They want to recruit developers. But if you look at European companies, that rarely tends to be the case, because we have great engineering talent in Europe. And the performance you get for your buck arguably goes much longer over here. I'll come back to that side of it. But there are either very specific, like really deep talents that are hard to attract anywhere else, or I would say the biggest talent gap that I see between Silicon Valley and Europe and the rest of the world is not in development per se, but it's in product management. It's in modern data-driven product management. We don't have a lot of experienced product managers over here, especially not in consumer, and that's for a good reason. It's not because we can't learn, it's because we've had a lot less opportunities to learn, because there have been a lot fewer highly successful European consumer startups. In Silicon Valley, you can hire people who, they learned the ropes at Twitter or Google or Pinterest or any company that's already been through that hyper-growth phase and learned how to do it and how not to do it. There's tons of that talent to tap into, and that's not really available at scale anywhere else in the world. So to me, that's sort of talent-wise the biggest unique aspect of that region. Anyway, you can find great talent. You can find a lot of mediocre talent too, of course, like anywhere, but you'll be paying through the nose for it. So let's start a little bit about the drawbacks of going there, whether it's moving or setting up a subsidiary in SF. And that's one of the big drawbacks is cost. It's a very expensive area. It's a very expensive place to hire people. This is oh wow. Oh, okay, it's just this TV. So here you can see the annual salary, the median annual salary of a software engineer in San Francisco and Warsaw. I pulled these numbers from a source that's called PayScale. My personal impression is that the San Francisco number is even a little bit on the low end. I would say it's probably trending up towards 120,000 or so, and you can easily go way above that for more senior people. I don't know what your impression is like. Is the roughly $20,000 a year a correct figure for software engineering talent over here? Anyone has an opinion? Is it too low, too high, roughly accurate? It's on the low end, yes. I'm sure salaries are going up here too, but they can keep rising for a while before closing the gap. So it's expensive. It's expensive to run a team over there, and it's particularly extreme on the engineering side, but it goes across the board. It's true for marketing talent. It's true for sales, especially true for management. Equally expensive is it to live there. So this is the median rent, dollars per month for an apartment in San Francisco, and again Warsaw. You probably have better insight than I do into the accuracy of the Warsaw number. The San Francisco number, I would say, is also a little bit on the low end. As I was leaving, the number for a one-bedroom apartment, if you need a little bit of a bigger place, was around $3,400 every month. So it's extremely expensive to live there, and the salaries need to be accordingly high to support your team. So I would say if you do want to go there, you should have very good reasons to do so, because it's going to increase your burn massively. On the other hand, you might raise more money by being over there, so that compensates. But that's also sort of it's a self-reinforcing loop, if you will. Out of all of the venture capital that's invested into Bay Area startups, roughly half goes right back to real estate owners. So the people who own the offices, the people who own the apartment buildings are the ones that are really making a killing on all of this investment, because the startups raise a lot of money, which pushes up salary, which means people can pay more for rent, which means rent goes up, which means salaries have to increase. So the other people can afford the higher rents, which means startups need to raise more money, and so on and so forth, as long as there's capital out there with willing investors. And there's a ton of capital sloshing around in the world right now because people are looking desperately for anywhere to get yield on their investments. So the other big downside of San Francisco, or of the US West Coast in general, is its geographic location. It is an extremely remote place. This is particularly noticeable when you're trying to run a two-office setup. You have one office here, you have one office over there. There's a 9-hour time difference between the two regions, which makes it very, very hard to have any sort of interactivity between the offices. As you can see on this simple diagram, even if you're working 10-hour days starting at 9 a.m., you have just a single hour of overlap, well, maybe two, between the two offices. So that means you'll have a lot of late nights and a lot of early mornings. A lot of late nights here, a lot of early mornings in SF if you try to have any sort of regular update meetings or hand-sold meetings or anything like that. So it does put a lot of strain on the team. It requires a lot of management bandwidth just to keep the teams working closely together. It's easy that the two teams feel alienated. So we had tons of issues at Wrapp with this. I'll come back to various alternatives to having this two-office setup and ways to manage it, but just be aware that a lot of that management bandwidth will be spent just on running your operations that should ideally rather be spent on building your product or selling your product or expanding the team, finding new markets, etc. The other side of their remoteness was something I didn't quite realize personally until I actually lived there. And that's how far away you are from everything else. So just to sort of, and this surprised me when I did it. I took the top 30 airports in the world by international passenger traffic, and then I sorted them by distance to Stockholm, which is my hometown, and San Francisco. And the result surprised me. Out of the top 30, only 3 are closer to San Francisco than to Stockholm, and I always consider Stockholm to be a pretty remote place. But it doesn't even come close to how far away the US West Coast is from the rest of the world. So it's one of the most remote, but still inhabited places that you can go to. Even Tokyo is closer to Europe than it is to the West Coast. And this is problematic for a couple of reasons. One, of course, it'll take a long time for you to get anywhere. If you have customers in Europe, if customers in Asia, you'll be spending even more time on airplanes. But the other aspect of this is that the geographical remoteness does create a bit of an insular climate over there. So people tend to become more isolated, I think, than in many other places. People live inside of the Silicon Valley echo chamber, and a lot of products are thought out specifically for that very narrow demographic of people, and people spend arguably less time than they should to outside trends, outside influences. Now, this is hugely generalizing, of course, and this doesn't really tell you anything about specific individuals, but as a trend, my perception is also that this is a little bit the case. People are not really paying attention to what's happening outside as much, and people have sort of the default view that all innovation originates here in Silicon Valley. People outside are mostly copying us. To a large extent, that's been true, though it's not exclusively the case, and I also feel that it's changing. Even while last century it was certainly America-centered, I feel this century is going to be Asia-centered. And this is personally also the reason for why I recently left San Francisco. It's a big world out there, and there's a lot going on outside of this place. So let's talk a little bit about alternatives to relocating to San Francisco. If you need the access to the US market, New York might be an option. New York is a great startup ecosystem in itself. It does have great investors, even though everything is, of course, small compared to the Bay Area. But its location makes it much easier to run an office there together with an office in Europe. We set up the first Wrapp US office in New York on 900 Broadway and 20th Street roughly. And that was much easier. 6 hours time difference gives you a lot more overlap in a day than 9 hours. 9 hours is really on the extreme end. You'll find more daily flights. You'll find cheaper flights. You'll find more direct flights from New York and most capitals of Europe. So it's a much easier location to have your US team in. Spotify, the Sweden-founded music streaming service where I worked before, set up its first office in the US, and it's still its biggest by far. It's its second biggest office and about 10 times larger than its San Francisco office. It does have a San Francisco office now, but the focus has been on the US. Sorry, the focus has been in New York. Right, so having thought a little bit about these options, I think one thing to consider is, should you move the whole, if you still feel that we need to move, and whether that's to New York or to San Francisco or arguably anywhere else, should you move your entire team over there? And if so, you probably want to do that very early while the team is still small. Or should you try to run multiple offices, one say in Warsaw, or one in London, one over in New York, one in SF maybe, or should you go just completely distributed and let people live anywhere in the world and recruit from anywhere? There's a lot of different options, and all of them have been tried and tested. Personally, my opinion on this, based on the experience of the last 4 years, is that I think you're probably going to go for one of the extremes. You either want to have everyone in one geographical location so that you can maximize the benefit of having that high bandwidth face-to-face communication every day. Everyone can get in front of a whiteboard. Everyone can share in your product development discussions. Everyone can share in your user feedback, sitting in the same room. Or if you're not going to do that, then I feel you might as well go completely distributed and just recruit from all over the world, let people work wherever they are, and then you can tap into a global talent pool. It'll put a lot of requirements, both on management, but even more so on just establishing processes and having like a very, very sort of thought through and thorough and process-driven way of working together, so that you make sure that kind of all material is accessible to everyone regardless of location and so forth. But even if you only have 2 offices, you incur most of the cost of those requirements anyway, because it's really important then that you make sure that everything, all material you produce are actually accessible to any team member regardless of which one of the 2 offices they're in, and then you might as well let them be in more offices. That's become my opinion on the case. It didn't used to be. I used to think it's much easier to run 2 offices than 3 and so forth, but I think the big cost is when you go from 1 to 2, and then incrementally to have many offices is not as much of a cost, and you have additional benefits of flexibility. So there are successful examples of companies that have been like completely geographically distributed. One of them is MySQL, Finnish, Swedish database company, was acquired by Sun at one point, now part of Oracle, but still one of the biggest databases powering websites out there. They started out partially as an open source product, which meant they already had developers all over the world. And eventually, as they started having revenue and had capital, they just started hiring some of the best open source developers who happened to live wherever they were. And they built a completely distributed team very successfully. So it's been done before, it can be done again. And it's an interesting model to consider. So anyway, having said that, and to end on a positive note, San Francisco is an amazing place, and maybe the reason for going there will be simply personal. A lot of people just want to go there and live there. It is fantastic. The weather is mostly great, and you're part of a culture that is extremely innovative and extremely open and tolerant, and seizes opportunities to do great things, improve the world, build great startups. So I don't want to discourage anyone, but I do want everyone to think through the realities of the situation and the pros and cons. That's pretty much all I have for you today. So I see we still have a little bit of time. I hope you have a lot of questions.
Well, thank you, because first of all, we can applaud him, exactly, yes. So I'm going to take a few questions from the floor before we enter this room. So I've seen a gentleman over there. Please.
I have a question about all the startups that are in the Bay Area. Do you consider that a big competition for the money, or do you consider that a big opportunity for the funders to get the talent?
I think it's a big opportunity. I mean, it'll always be competitive. I think that's would also be interesting research to do, like to look at sort of amount of available capital in the region, sort of divided by how many people are trying to get funding, how many startups are there that are unfunded or that are seeking funding. I have no idea what those numbers would look like, whether it's more capital per potential startup in Silicon Valley or in Warsaw or in Israel or anywhere else. I don't know. But I think that all these other startups are there. That's specifically the value of the place. That is what makes it unique and special. And it's I think that's true for startup culture everywhere. But it sort of grew out of there that everyone is very open to sharing. It's if you have a concrete question, something to talk about, something that at least slightly interesting, pretty much everyone will take a coffee with you, and they're very open about sharing, how their company is doing, what learnings you can draw from that, and so forth. So I think that's the key value of being over there.
Another question? I can have one for you otherwise. You just mentioned the openness of the culture, but isn't that, do you see that outside of Silicon Valley? Is it something that is actually growing? Because especially in emerging markets, for a long time, information was very clustered and people would not share it forward, and out of fear, like, oh, somebody will steal my ID, et cetera, et cetera. Do you see that changing over in your experience?
I think so. I think it used to be the case more, and I think it's still the case in more traditional industries in a lot of places, arguably including the US. But I feel startups everywhere, and startup founders and investors and all the ecosystem players are very open, regardless of where you go. I don't know. I love traveling. I love startups, so I tend to try to combine them wherever I go. I try to reach out to the local community and see who wants to meet up. And normally there's a handful of people who do, and they're all very open about what's going on there. So I
have time for one or two more questions eventually, if there are any. So yes, no. Do you want me to auction them otherwise? I think people actually want food, but the food is not coming yet, by the way, guys. So on that, thank you very much. You can applaud him once more.
Thank you.